There we go. Now, so welcome to the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook for December 2023. Pleased to have the state climatologist from Wisconsin, Dr. Steve Alvarez, on to do the presenting. Before he gets started, however, just a couple words. One is that if you have any questions or comments as we go along, please put them into the question interface. We tend not to monitor the chat very closely, so the question is where we'd like to see any questions or comments or concerns that you may have, questions as we go along. I also am joined by, or we are joined by Dennis Toddy, who is the USDA Climate Hub, Midwest Climate Hub Director as well. I am Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm a Regional Climate Services Director here based in Kansas City. So we're going to be talking about the north central part of the U.S. like we always have. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve. I think that's all I was supposed to remember at this point. And we'll take the questions at the end. We'll do a Q&A at the end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Doug. So this is my end of my first year as state climatologist in Wisconsin. So it's now my turn to lead one of these webinars. And at the outset, I think we'd all agree that that photo here is more aspirational than realistic. Winter has been slow to come in a big way around here, as we'll talk about today. Some general info. This seminar is designed to provide climate services to the north central U.S., and it's a collaboration activity with the organizations you see here. And these happen the middle of each month. So the next webinar will be January 18th of next year, and Jerry Brodsky, the Kentucky state climatologist, will be giving his first webinar, so please come to that. And if you're interested in past webinars, you can go to those links and find out what happened over each month for the past few years. And as Doug said, we'll have questions at the end in more detail. Before I get going, I will acknowledge that we are now having the winter solstice. Even though it has not been wintry, we do have dark days. And tonight at 9:30 or so Central Time, that will slowly change and we'll begin to get our daylight back. The schedule for today, covering 3 topics. First, current and recent conditions. The spoiler alert is warm and dry. You'll be hearing those terms a lot today. Then impacts with weather events first, and then the snow and ice shortage, and finally some noteworthy drought effects. And I'll close with outlooks, first for the upcoming holiday week, and then extending to the winter season and pointing out the strong El Niño influence on our weather this winter. Before going into today's topic, I just want to say, wow, what a difference a year makes, huh? This time last year, we were bracing for the monster extratropical cyclone that would convulse and affect most of the country, lead to an Arctic air outbreak, blizzards, the deadly blizzard in Buffalo, huge amounts of travel problems. The Weather Service warning map a year ago looked like an Easter egg. Every state in our north central region was under some sort of watch, warning, advisory, you name it. And on the left is the number of people affected. And when we fast forward to now, it couldn't be more different. There's not a single county in our north central region that's affected by even an advisory as of yesterday. So quite a difference in 365 days. But I am told that I need to fill the next 40 minutes, so I need to talk about something. And what I'm going to begin with is a review. And I'm going to review the November conditions and then the fall conditions as a whole. November was a warm month around the country. It was mild over the whole north central region. You see the light colors here, above average. Nebraska was much above average. So not remarkable in the sense of being record-breaking heat in November, but very uniform. It was warm all over. And that's something that's continued into December. Looking back at the whole season, we see some more dramatic effects of the warmth. It was exceptionally warm in the U.S. as a whole, the 6th warmest on record back to 1895. And with these temperature ranks, we notice the bigger they are, the more exceptional the warmth. In the north central region, these are very big numbers, meaning that they're among the top 10 warmest autumns in many of the north central states. Minnesota is top dog at number 6, the 6th warmest September through November on record there. But everybody participated in the unusual heat for the season. Now that's been a continuation of what's happened the whole year. The year-to-date temperature ranks shown here. It's been the 10th warmest year-to-date in the continental US, especially pronounced in the deep south, but here too in the north central region, especially to the east. Everywhere east from Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri has been in the top 10 in terms of warmest years to date through November, and we're certainly going to keep that up through December. And that is consistent with the big global warming this year. 2023 is almost certainly going to go down as the warmest year on record. And you see, especially in the northern hemisphere, these areas of exceptional warmth. You really have to go down to the Southern Ocean or Antarctica to find areas where the year has been cooler than normal. So we have been part of a bigger pattern. Turning to precipitation, I would say November was quietly arid across much of the Midwest. Here in Wisconsin, we were the 8th driest on record, and we were part of this cluster here in the Midwest. Top 10, top 11 driest Novembers on record. Indiana especially so, number 3 in the ranks. But to have this cluster is really remarkable here, and even the states around it, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, also quite dry. And interestingly, as a whole, the US had the 12th driest November, and only Florida stands out as a wet state. Everywhere else was either near average or, for the most part, below average, with some areas much below average in the interior. Looking out a little bit farther in the past for the whole fall season, here it's a little bit more complicated. There was this east-west split in the north central region, with the northern plains being on the wet side, above average precipitation, and then farther east on the dry side. And Indiana and Kentucky in particular were among the top 10 driest autumns on record. Those autumn conditions of warm and dry have largely spilled over into December, especially the warm part. This is showing the departure from normal temperatures for December. We're almost 3 weeks into it here through the 19th in this map, and it has really been warm almost everywhere. And the farther north you go, the bigger the warm anomalies. This is very much an El Nino-like pattern, almost classic, the northern part of the country getting the biggest warm spell. And in particular, notice Minnesota. So they just had such a warm autumn, and now they're continuing into December, and it looks like they may very well end up with the warmest December on record, depending on how things play out next week. So really, getting into record-setting territory, but even other states, just very mild, 6 to 9 degrees in orange, and then 9 to 12 degrees or warmer in these red areas. With precipitation, it's been more of a mixed bag, depending on where you are. Definitely some places, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, into Wisconsin, Indiana for sure. Places like that have been exceptionally dry in December, but there's been some other places, Illinois, northern Missouri, and especially Kansas, that got a big shot of moisture and heavy precipitation recently. Those have bucked the trend and have had above normal precipitation for December. And the Midwestern Regional Climate Center put together this graphic just noting how dry it's been in certain places this month. A few areas, the driest or top 5 driest, including parts of Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, and into Wisconsin. That probably will change for a lot of these areas in the next week. I'll get into that later, but for now, this is a reminder of just how dry we've been. A question I often get when we have an unusual month like this is, will these conditions continue? Will they persist? So I looked into this question, looking at the records for all the winter seasons in the recent period, 1990 to 2020, and I simply looked to see what's the relationship between temperature anomalies in December and then temperature anomalies the following month in January. And these are statewide averages of correlations. So just a simple correlation between these 2 months. 0 would mean that there's absolutely no relationship between the anomalies in each month. A 1 would mean that January perfectly follows December. So a warm December always means a warm January, and a -1 means they're completely out of phase. What you notice here is that there really is persistence. So these correlations are all positive, anywhere from about 0.2 to 0.4. Some of them are statistically significant in red, meaning they're not likely to be due to chance, but they also aren't that big. If we were using them for predictive purposes, we'd want them to be upwards of 0.5. But nevertheless, this map does show that there really is a physical persistence in the climate system from December to January, and this persistence is stronger in the northern states and as you move farther westward. So if you knew nothing at all about a forecast for January, you would probably assume that we'll continue as we have been. Now I want to move on to events and impacts, and I'm going to start here with this report from the Kansas Climate Office of a Thanksgiving weekend snowstorm that hit them. And in case you've forgotten, this white stuff here, it's called snow. We haven't seen much of it lately, but that's a reminder of what it looks like. And Kansas got a whole bunch of it right after Thanksgiving. And this picture from Manhattan shows a ½ a foot falling. And there were areas of Kansas that got a lot more than that, shown here in this map for a little over a day right after Thanksgiving. You see areas above 10 inches, and then this maximum about 14 inches, which apparently was the heaviest snowfall in a decade in that state. So a really remarkable but fairly confined snowstorm that hit Kansas. But that kind of cryospheric event has been the exception. What's been more the norm is the absence of snow and ice. And we see that in many parts of the country, especially areas like Wisconsin and Minnesota that are used to having snow and ice by now. This picture was taken by a colleague of mine, David Liebel, at Lake Wingra in Madison. It's a shallow lake. It typically freezes by now, but it has been flickering between freezing and thawing for the past couple weeks. And there's a very confused eagle out there in the middle of the lake on what's an ice flow that probably will disappear over the weekend. And we see examples not only around Wisconsin of minimal lake ice, but some noteworthy conditions in Minnesota, actually some scary ones. Recently, some folks who were ice fishing were stranded when a flow of ice they were fishing on broke off from the shore and moved off in the interior of the lake. There were about 36 people who were stranded and needed emergency rescue. And then another story that the Minnesota Ice Festival, scheduled for January 5th, has already been canceled because it's clear that there's just not going to be cold enough to form ice safely. They were planning to have this big ice maze shown in last year's event, but this speaks to the fact that the warmth of November spilling into December and possibly into January is leading to some tangible impacts in terms of winter recreation, which in northern states translates to dollars. And so we're seeing an economic impact from the warm weather of late. It's not only inland lakes where we see minimal ice cover, we're also seeing that play out on the Great Lakes. This is a map that shows Great Lakes surface temperatures. The colors are a little funky here, but blue and green means over 40 degrees. So you see places that are over 40 degrees. And the point I'm bringing out here is that the lakes are unusually warm and they have an unusually small amount of ice cover. The Great Lakes total ice cover right now is less than 0.5%. Normal is 3.5%. So it normally gets off to a slow start, but not this slow. And it appears that only a couple of bays way up in Superior have any ice at all. And given the forecast, it doesn't look like this is going to change greatly in the next week or so. But I do want to point out something that could become an impact, and that is when the lake waters are this warm and when the ice cover is this minimal, if we ever do get a big Arctic air mass coming down, this is a really favorable environment for a lake effect snow. That helped to happen last year around Christmas in Buffalo. And if we do get a cold air mass, that's something to keep an eye on. In terms, it's not just ice that's been minimal and missing, but it's been snow cover as well. It's not a surprise if you live around here and you're used to seeing snow, but this map really brings it home. This is the current snow depth around our region. And unless you go out to the Rockies, there's not a whole lot of snow around. This gray area is just a trace to 2 inches. And that's what we see even in places like northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota, North Dakota, places that normally have abundant snow cover by now, they are lacking. And it's really quite noticeable, and it's really, really different from last year on this date. This is what we were seeing last year at this time, an exceptional amount, especially in the Dakotas. But if I toggle back and forth here, you just see the night and day difference from 1 year ago. So here we are currently, the minimal snow amount, and here is our snow anomaly, a departure of snow depth from normal for this date. And we see the map is almost entirely yellow and orange. And if you look at the color scale, that means several inches deficit. Pretty much the farther north you go into the typical snow areas like the UP of Michigan, you see the anomalies grow in the negative sense. But basically everywhere here in the northern part of the region, and even going out into the Rockies, places where there may be snow cover, but it's not as much as usual. And to hit that home, I'm showing here the current snow water equivalent of snow in the western area. So this is an area that feeds into the Missouri River, and it's important for water resources. The snow water equivalent is shown here as percent of normal, yellow being less than 70 to 90% of normal, orange 50 to 70% of normal, and red being really low, less than 50% of typical. And in this area that's highlighted that feeds to the east into the Missouri River, we see that lots of areas are in the red or in the orange or in the yellow. Almost everywhere has a deficit. And that's a concern as the winter progresses, but I want to point out that it's quite early. It would only take a couple, 3 really good moisture-laden weather systems to change this picture quite dramatically, but that's where we are today, and so it's something to keep an eye on as we look ahead. Something else to keep an eye on, not an issue right now, but if we continue this snow drought and we do get cold air coming down finally, frost depth could become an issue. This is something that can be a problem with frozen pipes. I recall a winter here about 20 years ago when we had very little snow cover and cold air, and we had lots of problems with frozen pipes in houses. And so we monitor this really well in certain areas, and right now the frost depth is minimal, but this is sort of pointing out a latent problem that if we continue our snow drought and we get cold air coming down in January, frost depth penetration could become a problem. Right now, we've continued in recent weeks and months this long-term drought that, depending on where you are, it started early or it started this summer, and showing region-wide lots of yellow and orange and even red, indicating that much of our area, right, most of the area, is under some sort of a drought threat or drought status right now. The color coding here, moderate drought, much of Indiana, orange, severe drought, extreme drought in red in Iowa and Nebraska, and then one part of Nebraska, a small area, even has exceptional drought. This is the drought monitor as of this morning, and it doesn't usually change drastically in the winter because the soil moisture doesn't change a great deal this time of year. But one place that I really want to highlight is Iowa. You see that it is the state among the entire north central region that is suffering the most. This horseshoe shape of extreme drought is really problematic, and it's been there for quite a while. And there are some impacts from it. a report recently that Mayor of Osceola asked residents to forego drinking from the municipal water supply to conserve water and instead to drink bottled water as long as the drought conditions continue. And so that's pretty drastic. And our colleague, Justin Glisson, the state climatologist in Iowa, noted that last week was the 180th week in a row that parts of the state have experienced at least moderate drought. And that's nearly 4 years long and the longest continuous drought in the state since the 1950s. This puts the current situation into perspective in Iowa. There's a nice article in the Ag Weather Forum. Bryce Anderson noted that this drought has been going on quite a long time in Iowa and much of the upper Midwest. This map here is the departure from normal precipitation, not just for this year, but going all the way back 4 years to December of 2019. And you see that Iowa is ground zero for the biggest precipitation departure of all, more than 20 inches deficit. And granted, this is over 4 years, spread out over quite a while, but still, that's quite a bit. And it shows that Iowa conditions have been really dry, but also spilling over into Nebraska, Minnesota, parts of South Dakota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. So keep an eye on that, especially as we head into the spring. One of the expressions of the drought, of course, is minimized stream flow, and we see large parts of our area experiencing low flow. Certain areas in particular, Indiana stands out in a big way. You see that these oranges and reds correspond to percentiles in the 10th to 24th percentile range, and even lower than 10%. So of all the years, this is in the lowest 10% of stream flow in certain areas of Indiana, southern Illinois, parts of Missouri, much of Iowa, and into Kentucky. Now, not everywhere has gauges that are reporting this time of year. Some areas have frozen gauges that aren't reporting farther north, but of the ones that are showing data, this is the pattern. Now, we do see what appears to be pretty good conditions in northern Illinois and much of Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio. Those are areas that are in green, indicating the 25th to 75th percentile. But keep in mind, that's a pretty big range. I mean, 50th percentile is median or average. So if you're down in the 25, 26, you'd still be green, but actually having a pretty big shortfall. So stream flow is something we'll keep an eye on throughout the winter. Not surprisingly, given the drought, soil moisture is hard to come by in much of the region, even though it doesn't make such headlines typically this time of year when it's not the growing season. But you see, based on this product, this estimate of soil moisture, that conditions are extremely dry in much of the area, especially in the interior of the Midwest here. Indiana, especially southern Illinois, mentioned Iowa already, parts of Wisconsin, Missouri, very much so, and Kentucky and parts of Michigan. There are reports that the subsoil is bone dry in Iowa and Indiana, and that the cover crop growth in Indiana is very slow as a result of the dry conditions and dry soil moisture. And pointing out, in Iowa, for example, this could lead to some major agricultural impacts come spring if the drought persists. Now, if the ground stays warm and we get rain, that'll help with infiltration compared to frozen ground with snowfall on it. Already, there's concerns about fire potential come spring. This is a warning. I don't know if it's quite a forecast, but it's certainly an outlook for March of next year, showing areas from Missouri to Minnesota and over into Wisconsin having above normal risk for wildfires. And obviously this can change a lot between now and March, but I think it's worth pointing out here that already people are keeping an eye on what our winter drought may mean for conditions next spring. One of the concerns that we've seen for quite a while now with the drought is low levels on the Mississippi River and how it's affecting navigation. A couple of business stories featured here in headlines about how the dredging is becoming a very big need in order to keep the barge traffic flowing. Farmers use the barge traffic to transport their crops for export, and that has slowed and become more expensive. So one of the farmers interviewed said that they have rice sold that they're trying to deliver. It's supposed to be delivered to a river port, but they had to switch it to an inland facility because they can't do barges because the river is so low. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is still dredging to enable navigation, but smaller barge loads are the norm. So the traffic is still flowing, but it's just not flowing as quickly as it typically does. So there is a slowdown. Something else that's interesting is it's not just a drought that requires dredging and creates headaches on the Mississippi for navigation, but switches between strong flow and weak flow can be a problem. This is a story that came out of the Minneapolis Star Tribune recently that noted a quick switch from flood to drought is one of the most challenging dredging scenarios, because a sudden drop in flow means the water in the river loses velocity, and then all that sand that was flowing with it when the flow was high drops to the bottom and creates these pileups of sand that then require dredging. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that really is what happened in the upper part of the Mississippi River Basin, at least this year. In Wisconsin, I put together this graphic that shows what I call precipitation ping pong this year, because we have gone back and forth repeatedly. This is showing the precipitation anomaly in each month from January through November as a percent, green wet months, brown dry months. We had the wettest January to April on record, and then we suddenly flipped to the fourth driest May to August on record, followed by a wet October and a bone dry November. And it's this switchover from really strong high precipitation snowmelt into the drought that creates those kind of back and forth dredging problems that I just described. Okay, outlooks. Let's look ahead and see where we're going for the next week to season. So with the end of December, it's beginning to look a lot like Easter rather than Christmas. So I might be pushing it a bit with the daffodils, but we definitely see lots of green right now and not much white. And I happen to have bunnies living in my backyard, so I'm sticking with this photo for now. So what do I mean by Easter-like? Well, Christmas afternoon temperatures, according to the GFS model, are shown here. And you see temperatures that are not at all like late December, 50s throughout Illinois, Indiana, way into Michigan, all of Ohio, Kentucky, and then largely 40s, at least upper 30s elsewhere. You can struggle to find any temperature below freezing forecasted for Christmas Day. And you know, this is more like a map on opening day of the baseball season in early April. And I noticed that the ECMWF model is even more bullish with the heat. So we'll see. It's certainly going to be a mild Christmas in most places in our region. And here is the forecast for snow depth by Christmas afternoon, according to GFS. Minimal at best, according to this model. There may be a band from Colorado stretching up to Minnesota, northern Minnesota. The ECMWF has more favorable conditions for snow, so stay tuned with that. But even so, it's probably going to be a narrow band, definitely not region-wide. For most of us, it's going to be a wet Christmas more than a white Christmas this year. El Nino, it's been in the news in a big way and will continue to be our companion all winter. This is an unusual heating in the Pacific Ocean, the tropical Pacific. Its occurrence is not unusual, but its strength right now is. This is on the strong side of El Niños, and it has effects all over the world as it changes the atmospheric circulation. It typically produces winters like the schematic here, with warmer than normal conditions from Alaska over into the Great Lakes states, drier conditions for the most part in our area, although that's a weaker signal, and then a stronger subtropical jet stream bringing wetter and cooler conditions to the south. So this is the typical pattern, but it doesn't always play out that way. This year, it certainly has started El Nino-like around the US, and it's expected to continue that way. This is the new January outlook. It just came out this morning for temperature on the left, precipitation on the right. These are all expressed as probabilities rather than outright forecasts, but areas in the orange are above normal chances of warm conditions in January, very much like we've seen so far this winter and very much as we typically see during El Niños. Also a tendency for dryness, and that's shown here, although it's clearly not as strong a signal. Most parts of our north central region just have equal chances of wet or dry conditions going into January. If we extend this a bit, January through March, we see again a very much El Nino-like pattern, hardly any difference in the probabilities for temperature going out all the way into March. And then precipitation continued below normal chances of a wet late winter in the Great Lakes, and even below normal chances as you go way up into the northern plains. So if you just looked at this forecast, you would think, wow, there must be an El Nino going on. Now, just to make sure that we don't over-rely on El Nino as a forecast tool, NOAA has a nice climate.gov site that breaks this down. And they show winters during moderate to strong El Ninos since 1950, and they show the temperature anomalies around the US during all those winters. For strong El Ninos, there's only been 4 such events since the middle 20th century. 3 of them very much played out as we would expect throughout the upper US, unusually warm winters. But one winter did not play out that way. In the late 50s, it did in the northern plains, but once you got east of there, it was not. It was actually cooler than normal in much of our area. So that's worth taking note of. One of the 4 strong El Ninos didn't fit the bill. And when we extend the pool to look at more events, the moderate strength El Ninos, there's more of them. And here we see a lot of counterexamples. The 72-73 El Nino was moderate to strong, and yet it didn't produce an El Nino-like pattern. The 91-92 El Nino did, but not the 09-10, and definitely not the one in the mid-60s. This is almost the exact opposite of what we expect during an El Nino. Similar counterexample in the late 60s, but then there have been a couple examples in the mid-80s and mid-90s that did sort of play out that way. So the point is, El Nino loads the dice for a certain type of weather pattern in the winter, but it's not the only show in town. There are lots of other factors that affect our weather. So don't take it to the bank that we're going to have a warm winter during every El Nino. Another confounding factor in terms of anticipating winters is the warming climate. Regardless of El Nino, if we just look at temperature anomalies during the past 25 years, we see that the country as a whole has been warmer than it used to be, no surprise, and the northern states tend to be a bit warmer still than the rest of the country. And so this kind of muddles the picture. When we expect a warm winter from an El Nino, we also have to acknowledge that the winters as a whole have become warmer regardless of whether we have an El Nino winter. Now, looking ahead, just first on the short term, out to 7 days, I want to show the precipitation forecast through December 28th. This just came out this morning, and it shows some hopeful news, especially in areas that need precipitation desperately, which is most of us. This is showing a nice surge of Gulf of Mexico flow reaching all the way into Missouri, especially heavy in Missouri. This is the likely precipitation upwards of 1.5 inches in the magenta color. And then even in the areas in blue, this is at least 1 inch, 1.25 inches. And in December, that's a lot of rain in this time of year. It's a fairly dry month. So this is encouraging the fact that there's some heavy precipitation in certain places and then some quite significant rainfall expected in many other places throughout the central and upper Midwest. Looking ahead first to the week to 14-day outlook. So this is getting into the new year. This is the 8 to 14 probabilities for temperature, showing very much the typical El Nino pattern with above average chances of warm conditions, especially as you go farther north, and then less so as you go to the south. Precipitation, not great news. Here it's showing a stronger signal of below likely chances of wet conditions from middle of next week into the middle of the following week, very much like we've seen in much of the November, December time period already. So not great news for our drought, but California and farther south expected to be wetter, more typical of an El Nino. All right, so major takeaways from today. If you've been paying at all attention, warm and dry are the buzzwords for today, but we are likely to temporarily transition into warm and wetter for the next few days, as I just showed in that 7-day forecast. Not everywhere, but certain areas may get substantial amounts of mainly rain and then possibly snow as you go farther west. We are in this snow and ice drought of sorts, and that is affecting winter recreation, which affects economics, and water resources, potentially, especially out west in the mountains, filling up reservoirs. And then some latent potential issues down the road, as I've said before, is if we do finally get some cold air without a snowpack, that could lead to some deep frost penetration as well as lake effect snow. We're experiencing hydrological and agricultural drought. That's continued. That's led to low water tables, dry subsoils, and concerns for next spring come growing season, and fires. If you want a white Christmas, forget about it, unless you happen to be one of the lucky folks out west who may get the western edge of the snow from the cyclone passing by over the weekend from Colorado to Minnesota. But for most of us, it's not even a possibility. It's going to be way too warm then. Clearly, the wintertime El Nino weather pattern is alive and well and probably will continue. And that favors a warm northern US and a tendency for dryness in most of our region, the north central region, but the warm signal is typically stronger than the dry signal. And then finally, as I showed, a continuation of the mild winter is likely, but don't take it to the bank. There have been plenty of counterexamples of El Niños, even moderate to strong ones, that didn't play true to form and ended up being surprises. So that is the wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions now and comments that you might have.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. We do have a number of questions. I just want to reiterate some of your key points here in terms of the warmth and dry, because a lot of the questions are pertinent to what has happened and at least the short-term forecast well, the short-term forecast is for some rain, right? The week 2 forecast into next year is for dry again. So we're hoping to get some decent rain out of this. Not a lot of, I think travel probably is going to be pretty good, unless you don't like driving in the rain, for most of us in the Midwest, and some mix of snow, I guess, as you go further to the high plains and such. But why don't we go through the questions? I think Dennis and I have at least begun to answer some of them on the chat, or most of you can see those. And then we can comment sort of on some of the other things like El Nino as we go along here. It has been a very stereotypical beginning to an El Nino winter. We're not really into it that far yet, but the atmosphere certainly has behaved in a way to hold the cold air, the really cold air, up to our north. Even with a couple fronts coming through the next week or so, these are sort of Pacific origin fronts and not really pulling down any Arctic air. So there was a little bit of a hint of a stratospheric warming, which is what a lot of people refer to as a polar vortex, but really it's a polar vortex dipping down into our area in late January. But we'll see. I mean, that's so far out, and it's not really in the predictions at the moment. That's a shorter term or shorter scale that we don't usually predict at too much. So Anyway, first question is certain regions have been dry multiple years in a row, and a lot of our region has, and have had above average yields. I'm assuming for both corn and soybeans. At what point does the dry conditions start impacting some of those yields? And Dennis, you did answer that. Do you want to continue that conversation a little bit?
Yeah, it is an interesting question because the what people are commenting after the drought is the yields are better than they expected, but not always above average. We still have increasing yields in chunks of the Corn Belt. I didn't look state by state, but I did a recent presentation for Iowa, and I looked at corn and soybean yields in Iowa, and for the last 7 years, they are basically flat. There has been no trend in corn and soybean yields for the last 7 years. A chunk of those years have been drought years. There's probably a bit more to that. So not everywhere is seeing increasing yields, and some of these places that are the worst off are seeing the effects of this already.
And Dennis, do you want to comment on timeliness of precipitation, how much that matters, and maybe even temperatures and that impact on dryness or lack of whatever?
Yeah. What Doug's getting at is the thing that we know about corn yields and soybean yields, the major commodity crops, is even in the middle of a drought, if you get rainfalls at appropriate times and appropriate through the year, like this last year, for example, we had very dry, very severe drought conditions through June. Latter part of June, early July, there were several rainfalls around the region. That's about the time when corn reaches tasseling, and that's a critical yield time for corn. So that combined with some cooler temperatures helped to eke by. In addition, much of the region we planted into dry soils. Dry soils will allow crops to develop root systems that are much more developed, much deeper, so they're able to take advantage of any rainfall and moisture and nutrients through the year much more effectively. Or maybe get deeper in the soil and reach in some moisture deeper in the soil. The problem we're running into now is we have really removed most moisture to some level in the soil. So there's not a whole lot of moisture left at this point, and hence why we need multiple rainfalls, some through the winter and the spring, to be able to refill that soil moisture profile.
Yeah, and we don't really like seeing above normal temperatures for the most part, either, even in the cool season, which we're in now. That doesn't help. And the other thing about the 3 to 4 years of whatever drought, we're starting to see the repercussions in the bigger rivers, right? So the Ohio and the Mississippi, and to some degree the lower Missouri, in terms of that base flow base flow sort of getting lower and lower as things slowly dry out in the lower levels. Moving on, we can talk a little bit about, we can talk a little bit, maybe Steve, poor winter wheat condition adversely impact double crop corn and soybean planted in the same regions the winter wheat was harvested. I don't know how to answer that one, Dennis or Steve.
I'll let Dennis handle that one.
Well, okay, yes. If you have poor winter wheat conditions, which may be driven by dry soils, whenever you get to, whenever you harvest that crop, if the soils are still very dry, you could see an impact on the double crop if you're double cropping. But that's the double crop ones are more south and eastern Corn Belt, which are dry, but they also are wetter climatologically, so they have a better opportunity to get moisture because they get rainfalls through the winter. Part of that region that Steve showed in the 7-day QPF we'll get some more moisture back in the soil, and their soils aren't frozen, so the water is going to be able to enter the soil. So they have a better chance of being able to recover. So, and I would assume people might make a decision not to plant a second crop if soils were that dry. But again, we go back to the earlier comment about if you get rainfalls at the right time, you can get crops can muddle their way through and still yield decently, even though you may be overall kind of dry.
And Dennis, if I'm not mistaken, and Steve, we did hear that winter wheat so far this year from at least South Dakota South, I imagine North Dakota South is decent so far. Is that what we've heard conditions?
I think yesterday is what we heard.
Yeah, the last NASS report was last month. Some of the plains area was a little rough with some of the drought areas out there, but not terrible. And I think the Eastern Corn Belt, the only problem in the Eastern Corn Belt was there was delays in getting winter wheat planted because the corn was delayed in some of the areas in the Far East.
Steve, I think you had the article. I don't know if you showed it or not, but you definitely read the article by Bryce. And you've seen reports from the state climatologist out of Iowa, Justin Gleason. And the question is, how much precip would be needed and over how much time to improve soil moisture in various regions? In this case, we'll just talk about Iowa for long-standing drought issues, since it seems to be the heart of some of those long-standing issues.
The map from that article was showing more than a 20-inch deficit going back 4 years. And so that's really bound to be affecting the deeper soils as well, not just the shallow ones. So it's going to take quite a while for a 4-year drought to be remediated.
Yeah, and so in other words, we've built up these deficits over the last few years in terms of moisture, and thus the drier soils. And so what it takes are these sort of cooler season, slow rains, if you will, as opposed to sort of convective big thunderstorm rains, which tend to run off more. We like a slow rain. We love slow rains as long as the soil's not frozen. So a number of those over a number of months. And that's just what it takes, and maybe a couple of years too.
And the ongoing problem we have with the warm and dry conditions right now is we don't evaporate water, we don't transpire water through growing crops, and we don't evaporate water from the surface as rapidly as we do during the summertime. But we still are losing, if there's water at the surface, soil surface, some of that is still evaporating with these relatively warm temperatures. So even if we get a little bit of rainfall, we're losing some of that back to the atmosphere again when we have open conditions, when we don't have snowfall covering the ground.
Next question is water storage in the Upper Missouri Basin, and I'll speak a little bit to that in terms: is there enough help with river flow management given the existing lack of snowpack? I believe the Corps would, anybody on the Corps want to speak up, feel free. But the Corps would mention that they have several years of drought tolerance built into those major reservoirs, and so that they've managed the river such that they have enough water, unless it was like a 10-year drought or something like that. And I'm sort of speaking out of my ear a little bit on that, but they have scaled back. They have scaled down to their typical winter releases from Gavin's Point Dam, the bottom dam. There is some concern, however, in the lower Missouri, because the lower basin has been so dry, lower basin of the Missouri River, that water intakes for municipalities and energy producing facilities may have some risks there coming into the winter, especially if it gets super cold and we start getting ice forming on the rivers. So it's something to watch, and there is remediation for that, and the Corps usually handles those things. And then same commenter said, ping pong of heavy flow to drought also brings a lot of issues of stream bank stability, a lot of negative issues to that. And I agree that the extremes in terms of flow seem to have increased. And I think there actually are some studies that show that. Does lack of snow during winter hinder planting methods such as soil tillage? Will the lack of snow impact producer planting intentions, adversely impact crop emergence? Yeah, anybody?
Okay, there's a lot in there. Okay.
Just say yes.
Yeah. Well, okay. What we are likely to see, and I've made this comment in talks, because the soils are dry and we're unlikely to get enough rainfall to overcome the seriousness of the dryness, we fully expect for people to be able to get in the field relatively early in the spring, or certainly not be delayed by wetness. You can get cold that can slow things down, but that seems unlikely. So there's that part. We actively encourage people to reduce tillage anyway, but even more so during dry conditions, because every tillage pass costs you moisture. You lose moisture in that tillage pass. So that's something that we want to try to do. Will people make decisions? They probably will, some, but maybe not as much as we want them to. People have their crop rotations. They'll probably stick with that crop rotation. One of the recommendations is maybe adjust your fertilizer recommendations. Don't expect to get the maximum yield when you have this dry soil, so don't try to fertilize that amount, because that's just going to be wasted. I mean, there will probably be people taking this some into account. I also expect some people to charge right ahead and do what they're going to do without regard for what's going on.
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to jump around a little bit. This was for you, Steve. Can you talk more about how snow or lack of snow, actually, plus very cold temperatures create problems? Is that because there's no insulation for the soil? And you might talk also a little bit about structures as well when cold gets really deep.
Yeah, so snow is a very good insulator, and that's why a lot of winter animals hide under snowpack because it is such a good warm insulator. And so having, even if the air is really, really cold, if there's a thick snowpack, the ground can stay relatively warm. And so the removal of that snowpack is really problematic if it does get cold. And so because it's, frost penetration takes time to get to a deep level. It's not just like a 1 or 2 cold days would cause problems, but if we had a prolonged stretch of sub-zero temperatures for like a week or two, wow, and we had no snow cover, that could really become a problem. That's not on the horizon, it looks like, anytime soon, but if it does emerge, I mean, January and February are the coldest months of the year, so it's still possible. So that's the reason why snow cover, or the absence of snow cover, is a concern. And the second part, Doug, was something about structures.
Well, if cold gets too deep, we've had issues, at least in the Kansas City area, of sort of things built that especially if it's dry, that cold gets down there and then water gets down there and cracks foundations, things like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so they could cause some structural foundational problems. I'm just familiar with, the pipes, water potentially if they aren't well insulated.
Right, water pipes, that's another good one. Yep. And that's unusual in the north because usually there's snow.
Right.
So, okay, there was also a question about counterexamples of expected El Nino patterns last 50 years. Most look like the 50s and 70s on the example shown. There is things we don't have enough of them to be really hard statistically found, but we have rules of thumb on some of these El Ninos. The stronger ones tend to behave more like an El Nino pattern we would expect to get. The weaker El Ninos, and weaker being not as warmer than normal, but not really, really warm in the eastern Pacific, equatorial Pacific. So there are sort of degrees of warmth or degrees of strength, we call it, in El Nino. These are human-made decisions on what is weak and what is moderate and what is strong. So there's a lot of we're pretty careful about saying anything too explicit about how El Nino is going to behave, and that we give you what we think will happen, and it does help our forecasts quite a bit. But we've also seen record warmth Decembers in the past during La Nina conditions flip to record cold in January and or February. We've seen that happen in the last few years, as a matter of fact.
And Doug, a nuance of that, kind of a twist, is that sometimes the El Nino can behave basically like it typically does. For instance, typically we get strong flow of moisture off the Pacific that hits Southern California and gives them a lot of winter rains. The really strong El Nino in 2015, 2016 produced a dry Southern California, and instead that wet river pattern went farther north, and the Pacific Northwest got hit. So even though the atmospheric circulation response was basically what we expect from an El Nino, because it was shifted geographically a few hundred miles, it meant for a blown forecast. So it's tricky. You can get the pattern sort of right, but if it's in the wrong place just a little bit, it can look like a real bust of a forecast.
And here's another decent question in regards to potential fire weather, which we normally do not talk about in December, by the way. It's not something we go out and we just happened across that outlook. We do look at those outlooks periodically, but what I was going to say is it surprised us a little bit to see that in the Midwest, of all places, in March. And there's a reason for that. The reason is it's been dry. It could stay dry. The forecast is for relatively dry. And it gets windier. Winds, it's a windy time of year. So the question really, though, was potential fire weather. Where do you get potable water? The good thing about putting out fires is you don't need potable water. You just need water, right? So you can get that out of lakes and rivers or whatever. You don't necessarily. It's not necessarily sewage water, but it is not necessarily also water that you would drink. If that was the question, I assume. And where do you get it? It really depends on the locality, right? Anybody else want to talk about that?
Yeah, I don't know the fire weather climatology too well, but my sense is that spring, March, April, especially April here in Wisconsin, is a common fire month to the extent we get them. We certainly had that with this current April when we were warm and dry for the first half of the month. But of course, you don't think of wildfires as being extensive here as we do in the Southwest or the Northwest, Pacific Northwest.
Yep. And Dennis, I'll put you on the spot. Any outlook and insight for how the crucial spring summer rains will look? And I would say we could go to the outlooks for AMJ. If you want to pull that up, Steve. Since you're live, you'd have to get out of your presentation and open up an internet access and look at April, May, June. But anyway, but Dennis, do you want to start on that in terms of sort of El Nino potential impacts and what that may mean for the Midwest indoor plains?
Sure. El Nino is strong right now, but the signs of it weakening are out there. We expect El Nino to weaken this spring and be a limited factor and really not much of a factor by summertime. That can change, so we'll have to keep an eye on that, but that's what we expect at this point. Steve's got that up here right now, like that March, April, May time period, still a 75% chance of being in El Nino, a 25% chance of being in neutral. It is interesting that you see the chance of La Nina increasing as we go through the summer, and actually by fall, there's a chance of being back in La Nina again. Okay, what is that? What can we say about spring and summer at this point? Not a ton. Basically, the Climate Prediction Center falls back on trend. So they use trend as an indicator for what's going to happen. But with this, what we also fall back on is what do we know at this point? We know that soils are very, very dry. So places that aren't too bad, we have a better confidence something will improve. The driest areas like in Iowa, the likelihood of improving or making things, really good by springtime is very unlikely. So we know that there's a fairly large level of risk going into this growing season. Again, they can be timely and get us through, but the risk of something happening is much higher when our soil is this dry. We just don't have the carryover moisture to go along with it.
Dennis, what's showing on the screen right now?
This is March, April, May.
Okay. Yeah. So
Yep.
there's the outlook for precipitation on the bottom. Low probabilities of above normal precipitation up through Nebraska and south and a little bit east. Southern plains, basically. So that's the outlook. These things, we don't always show them all because it's pretty far out into the future, as you commented. So we show some of it. Sorry, we're going a little bit over. I have just a few more comments and then we'll be done. And you can go enjoy your holidays. There's a comment here that says derecho August 10th, 2020 killed a lot of tree canopy in Iowa. Is there any idea of how much of an impact, if any, it has on the droughts, snow, frost, rain included, or actually, weakened trees a lot too, I imagine, as well in Iowa. And so the drought probably isn't helping that either. I don't know if anybody has a idea around the Midwest on trees. I know Minnesota really got hit hard too in the last few years with trees.
That's a great question that I don't even have any idea how to address.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how extensive the tree damage was in terms of area.
Right. Well, we do know that a series of events, including derechos, including long-term drought, can really hurt trees. And it takes sometimes years for trees to die. So if there are people who want to comment on that, feel free. But we're not foresters. But Dennis is closest to those people, so he'll have an answer next month. Okay, are there any analog years to this winter? And unfortunately, the person put in 2011, 2012. And so we don't want to see that. If you remember, 2011, 2012 was very warm winter. In fact, we had 2 or 3 weeks of the 80s in March across a large area, including the Great Lakes. And it was just warm. And then we went into record dry conditions. Am I saying that's going to happen? Nope. And do we pay attention to analog years? Either one of you, Steve, Dennis.
I think it's dangerous. The smaller the sample size, the riskier that approach is.
One thing we could do, Steve, is maybe talk about as the climate is changing, we expect to see, excuse me, more warmer potential winters, and more, as Dennis said, more evaporation and things that could lead to early season drought and that kind of thing. So, yeah, but
right. As Dennis pointed out, the lack of snow cover it not only insulates for warmth, but it helps to trap the moisture. So if we warm enough in a winter now or in the future to not have much snow cover, then the warmer soils combined with the lack of insulating blanket both would translate to higher evaporation from the soils in winter.
And then the final comment really was from Virgil. Thanks, Virgil. Water in the soil actually is a good heat sink as well. It stores heat. Without good soil moisture, ground will freeze deeper more quickly, which is a good comment. Okay, anything, Dennis, we want to hit on a little bit more or make a point of before we go? Thanks to everybody else who stayed on this long. Or Steve, do you have anything else you want to highlight?
Actually, Doug, if you hide your screen here, I've just got one, as long as I've got this background graphic up. The question came up about what's going to happen next summer, and we were talking about El Nino and La Nina. It might be surprising to consider that, given how strong the current El Nino is, that there's a potential that we could flip all the way to a La Nina, the opposite phase, by summer. But it wouldn't be unprecedented. Just because we have a strong El Nino doesn't mean we have some sort of momentum that keeps us from transitioning to into a La Nina quickly. The 97, 98 El Nino was one of the strongest on record. And the next winter, we were in La Nina phase, 98, 99. So it has happened before, but it is very difficult to predict ENSO conditions beyond the spring. So I would take this graphic with a grain of salt at this point.
Yep. It is very unusual. It is unusual to have El Nino after El Nino, 2 years of El Nino, but it's not as unusual to have a couple of years of La Nina in a row.
But to add to what Steve said, if you think back, we were in La Nina conditions late winter.
Yep.
And we transitioned quickly to El Nino, and now the potential for going back again, which we will have to watch, is one of these examples of a fairly significant flip-flop.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And I think that pretty much finishes off 2023. I want to say thank you to everybody. You should not have to, and I should have said this at the beginning, you should not have to reapply to be in these webinars. I believe I've continued the series through the next year with the same URL, if you will. So if you signed up once, you should still be signed up. My fingers are crossed on all of that. And if I'm wrong, I'll be unhappy. So anyway, happy holidays. Thank you very much, Steve and Dennis, for your help on these things. And we'll see you next year.
So long.